It gladdens me to know that Odin prepares for a feast. This hero that comes into Valhalla does not lament his death. I shall not enter Odin's hall with fear. My death comes without apology, and I welcome the Valkyries to summon me home.
The Viking Advance. Chapter 2. The Viking gods who presided over the heavenly and earthly arenas were lusty fellows, cast from the same rough mold as the Vikings themselves. Leading the pantheon was Odin, one-eyed magic god of wisdom, war, and frenzy, a spirit of great cunning and bravery, protector of chieftains and poets alike. There was Thor, a stormy-tempered, hammer-wielding redhead who, as the slayer of giants and ruler of winds and rain, was a favorite among soldiers, seafarers, and farmers. And there was Frey, a lascivious god of peace and fertility who helped to assure a bountiful harvest on land and sea. Frey possessed perhaps the most enviable of Viking equipment, a collapsible boat which could be folded up to fit into a small pouch when not in use and expanded to accommodate the entire company of the gods at Frey's command. The Viking gods had won their treasures of silver and gold by conquest and theft, by feats of daring and guile, just as did the mortal Vikings. And as Viking gods stole like men, so did they rage and fight. In Scandinavian literature, the Viking god Thor is the essence of the hard-drinking, pugilistic Viking age. In one poem, he devours an ox, 8 salmon, and 3 cups of mead in a single meal. In others, he smashes enemy giants and demons by hurling boulders, thunderbolts, and his boomerang-like hammer into their mighty skulls. By the early 9th century, some earnest Christian missionaries had begun to compete for heathen Viking souls by teaching them the gospel. Louis the Pious, the French king who reigned in France when the Vikings were beginning to settle there, periodically staged elaborate baptismal ceremonies to receive them into the Christian faith. The Vikings were willing enough to add yet another god to their pantheon, and many of them seem to have gone cheerfully through any number of Christian rituals for the prize to be had. On one occasion, there were so many Christian converts that there were not enough cloth for the long white baptismal gowns that were customarily given out on such occasions, so the cloth was cut into smaller pieces to make it go further. The oldest of the Vikings was then heard to complain loudly that this was the 20th time he had been baptized, and he had always got a beautiful gown out of it, but this sack they had issued him was simply fit for a cowherd, and if I were not ashamed of it being naked, you could immediately give it back to your Christ. In time, Christianity won some sincere followers among the Vikings, but even the Norsemen took to the new faith with ambivalence. Of Helgi the Lean, son of a Swedish sea rover and of an Irish princess, it was noted that he believed in Christ and yet made vows to Thor for sea voyages and in tight corners, and for everything that struck him as of real importance. Even to his own gods, who remained powerful long after the rise of Christianity in Scandinavia, the Viking pledged his trust only on condition of mutual benefit. The Vikings loved tales of fortitude and independence in the face of adversity. They roared with approval upon hearing of an old bondy who boasted, "At one time the peace had lasted so long I was afraid I might come to die of old age, within the doors, upon a bed." And they liked to think of themselves in the image of such dashing figures as Gunnar Hunmarsson, one of the heroes in the sagas, a tall, powerful man whose sword strokes were so fast he seemed to be brandishing 3 swords at once. Gunnar had looks as well as talents, with his fair skin and straight nose slightly tilted at the tip, keen blue eyes, red cheeks, and fine head of thick, flaxen hair. Another popular figure was Skarpedin Njálsson, who one day caught sight of his hated foe, Thrain Sigvason, standing with a troop of followers on an ice floe across a great gap of running water. Skarpedin made a prodigious leap over the water, holding an axe over his head, and came sliding along the ice so fast that Thrain was still putting on his helmet when down came the blow clear to his jaw, spilling his teeth onto the ice. And then, leaping over a shield that was thrown his way, Skarpedin slid on to safety before any of the crowd of his enemies could so much strike a blow at him. Honor, daring, valor, strength, and agility, these were all qualities the Vikings prized and upheld. There was another, somewhat less admirable side to their nature as warriors that Vikings were only too pleased to emphasize. This was their wild ferocity and brutality toward their foes. Indeed, they seem to have exaggerated it deliberately in order to overawe their enemies. Just as they carved the prows of their ships in the shapes of dragons and other horrid beasts to terrify the superstitious as they came surging out of the sea, so they cunningly circulated tales of their own savagery. One horrifying tale describes how after a battle between Danish Vikings and 2 English kings in 867, the Norsemen broke open the rib cage of the captured king of Northumbria and ripped his lungs out of his back, something they called carving the blood eagle, in allusion to the 2 lobes flapping like wings in the last dying breaths of the victim. Stories of such tortures, passed by Vikings and vanquished alike, conveyed the clear message to peoples everywhere that it would be wiser to yield than to try to thwart the relentless drive of the Norsemen. Such cruelty was not simply the figment of a saga writer's imagination. It occurred all too often. So did another kind of wild behavior attributed to the Vikings, the bizarre actions with which some of them swarmed into battle. They would roll their eyes, bite the edge of their shields, and utter animal howls. They would rush towards their adversaries without thought of pain or danger, sometimes without any protective armor. A warrior who behaved in this way was called Berserker, an Old Norse word that has variously been interpreted as bare skin, meaning without shirt, and bear skin, in possible reference to animal skins some of the men might have worn. Anglicized to berserk, the word came to symbolize the Viking terror. Not every Viking fought that way, of course. Modern scholars suggest that such fantastic behavior may have been the result of drunken rages brought on by great draughts of ale or wine just before combat, or of paranoia, or of possibly genetic flaws in individuals. Whatever the cause, a number of Vikings, no one knows the percentage, did go berserk when they fought. And some kings and jarls found it useful to have bodyguards made up of these men, or to use them as shock troops, or simply to spread terror wherever they went. With fighting occupying so much of their thinking at home and abroad, it would seem that Norsemen lived by no laws at all. But such was not the case. Viking laws, like Viking literature, evolved out of age-old traditions. They were committed to memory, transmitted orally, and when occasion demanded, were recited aloud by a learned lawgiver. Under Viking law, a jarl or bondi charged with a crime such as theft or murder was brought before a court of judges made up of his peers. The accused could either plead guilty or innocent, and if the latter, he could go on to argue his case by calling witnesses to testify both to the facts and to his honesty and good character. To further substantiate his case, he could request, or the judges could demand, trial by ordeal. Such an ordeal usually began on a Wednesday, the day of Odin, god of wisdom. The individual was given a handful of red-hot stones or scraps of metal to hold for a dreadful moment or two, and then sent away with a bandage until Saturday, when the judges reconvened to look him over and reach a consensus. Their decision was based not on whether his hand was burned, which it invariably was, but rather on the severity and cleanliness of the burn. If it was clean, the defendant was deemed to be innocent. If it was festering, then he was pronounced guilty. A man found guilty of wounding one of his peers in a brawl was required to make bone payment to the victim in silver coins, 1 for a small wound, 6 for a large one, and to also pay for the cost of treatment. The law said if a wound needed cauterizing, then the same payment is payable every time cauterizing is necessary. Another law decreed a series of fines for unseemly touching of a woman, 4 ounces of silver for touching her wrist or her ankle, 2 2/3 ounces for touching her elbow. But a touch above the knee, the law continued, whether with tongue-in-cheek or in dead earnest is not recorded, is called the fool's clasp. No money is payable for that. Most women put up with it when it goes that far. There was certainly no humor to the other punishment to which miscreants might be condemned, and that was outlawry. A man found guilty of murder might be declared an outlaw, either for a limited period, a few months or a few years, or forever. As an outlaw, he could not fish, trade, join a Viking expedition, or ask assistance in an hour of need, not even from a member of his own family. Permanent outlawry was tantamount to banishment. Men on whom that lonely sentence fell had no recourse but to flee. Outlawry was in fact the reason that many a Viking left his homeland. In most early societies, right went hand in hand with might, and enforcement of the laws depended in large measure on who was the strongest, complainant or defendant. A king or powerful jarl might seek to uphold the laws as a matter of self-interest in order to consolidate his rule and keep the peace. But where no such enforcement existed, a Viking might refuse to accept the judgment of a court or might decline to appear altogether. In that case, the injured party and his angered family had no recourse but to seek restitution, if necessary, in blood. And this was one of the primary reasons for the continued blood feuds and internal fighting and bloodshed that raged throughout the Viking Age. The question remains, why the sudden explosion of Viking energy at the end of the 8th century? Not the least extraordinary thing about the Viking achievement is that there were so few Vikings. Scandinavia was not thickly populated. No more than 2 million souls could have been living there when the Viking Age opened at the dawn of the 9th century. That was only a small fraction of the population of the empire that Charlemagne bequeathed his son in 814. One principal reason for the expansion overseas was that the Scandinavian population, though small in absolute terms, was growing rapidly, too rapidly to be peacefully absorbed into the Norse society. Medieval ecclesiastics of the other lands, observing this sudden explosion of Vikings out of the north, ascribed it to the sexual prowess of the northern heathen. They were polygamous, said Adam of Bremen, and therefore had swarms of children. They had wild, promiscuous rites of spring every year, insisted the Norman chronicler Dudo of St. Quentin, and thus ensured a yearly crop of babies. A likelier explanation for the increase in population was a change in the climate. Northern Europe was perceptibly warmer around 800 AD than it had been in preceding centuries. The glaciers receded all over Scandinavia. There was more land that could be used for crops or pasture. The winters were shorter and milder. So decisive a factor was winter in the life of northern countries that Vikings counted time in not years, but winters. A long, cold winter could mean that provisions put away in the fall might run out while the weather was still too severe to replenish them by hunting or fishing. And then the weak, the old, and the very young would die. Gentler winters meant that more babies would survive. More would grow up to swell the active, turbulent pool of younger sons, since the property generally went to the oldest, where landless, footloose, bursting with energy and ready for adventure. The warm winters also provided the Norsemen of the 8th and 9th centuries with an unusually protein-rich diet. Their herds of cattle and flock of sheep were prospered, and more fish could be caught. This made the Vikings bigger and stronger, and gave them considerable advantage over their adversaries. European chroniclers tended to see them as positive Goliaths. "Never did I see a people so gigantic," wrote the Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan. "They were as tall as palm trees." That was an exaggeration, but male skeletons in Scandinavian graveyards of the period averaged 5 feet 8 inches, an impressive height for the time, when few people stood taller than 5 feet 5. The sagas had a more imaginative explanation for the Vikings' advance on the world than diet and climate. Snorri Sturluson, the 13th century Icelander who set down a collection of sagas recounting the reigns of gods and kings from the beginning of time to his own day, ascribed the migration of the Vikings to the bloody deeds of Harald Fairhair, first known as Harald Halfdanson. Around 860, he inherited a minor kingdom upon the death of his father and vowed not to groom his shaggy head until he had brought to heel a handful of jarls who contested his right to rule. The jarls did not yield meekly. One, named Herlaug, had himself buried alive in a funeral mound rather than to submit to Harald. Those who seized their swords and summoned their retainers did so only to die on the battlefield. One by one, a number of others found resistance futile and followed the example of Herlaug's brother, Hrolaug, going to their knees to Harald. Then, the tale continues, the king called for his scissors and comb, had his long yellow locks cut off, and emerged from the barber as Harald Fairhair. For all its fanciful detail, this lively tale reflects the historical fact that sometime around 872, almost 100 years after the raid on Lindisfarne, Harald Fairhair established the first centralized rule over the disparate settlements scattered throughout his hills and valleys of Norway. wresting from dozens of chieftains their lands and their time-honored independent rule over local provinces. In the near century that had elapsed since the plundering of Lindisfarne, the wide-ranging Viking ships had brought home more than booty from their expeditions abroad. Together with silver and gold came Christian fashions and cropped hair and centralized rule. The saga does not end here, it only begins. Some of the nobles, too proud to bow to Harold, loving life too much to resort to the funeral mound, found another way of evading Harold's unwelcome aspirations. They loaded their ships with their wives, children, followers, cattle, slaves, and household goods, sailed across the sea, and settled on new land. And indeed, archaeologists can date the appearance of Viking colonies in the Shetlands, the Orkneys, and Iceland to the last third of the 9th century, the very time when Harald Fairhair was consolidating his power as king of Norway. Typical of the Bondi who raided, invaded, and colonized abroad was one Egil Skallagrimsson, the 10th century hero of a popular saga. His raiding expeditions were carried out pitilessly. The saga is a series of gleeful accounts of triumph over the weak and the gullible. Egil was exceedingly ugly and, like his father, black of hair, says the saga. Notwithstanding that disclaimer, the eye of the Viking beheld him as a thing of beauty. He was a fearless fighter, a loyal friend, and a colossal drinker who could empty one ox horn full of ale after another without passing out, and also a daredevil who could keep his wits about him in the worst of predicaments. Right from the start, he showed promise. He took his first drink when he was 3 and committed manslaughter at 7. In a tiff over a ball game with a youngster named Grim, Egil became wroth and heaved up the bat and smote Grim, killing his playmate. Servants and relatives came up with loud cries, and before the fracas was over, 7 men were dead. Egil's mother, clearly the proper helpmeet for a Viking male, pronounced her son to be of Viking stuff, and said that as soon as he was the age, his family would fit him with a fleet keel and fair oars to fare abroad with Vikings and hew men in twain. He was only 12 when the wish of his mother's heart was granted. In due course, he was to be found leading Viking expeditions across the far seas. Coming ashore with a dozen followers in a region known as Kurland in modern Latvia, Egil scoured the countryside, slaying hither and yon, and filling his ships with spectacular hauls of treasure. But an adventure would be no adventure without all the narrow escapes, and Egil had plenty of those. In a clash one night with a Kurland farmer and a troop of his followers, Egil and his comrades were overwhelmed by vastly superior numbers and taken prisoner. The farmer wanted to execute them all right then and there, but his son, a bloodthirsty lad, argued that it would be more pleasant to wait till morning, when they could see the expression on the faces of the men as they were being tortured. The farmer agreed, and the prisoners were fettered and thrown into an outbuilding, while the Kurlanders went off to a victory feast. Egil's giant hulk had impressed his captors, and they had bound him hand and foot to a thick, upright pole. But as soon as he and his friends were left unguarded, he used his strength to twist and tug at the pole until he was able to yank it out of the ground and could work his way free from it. He untied the ropes on his hands with his teeth, then unshackled his feet and freed his companions. They began to explore the property. In another building, they heard cries from under their feet, pried loose some boards, and discovered 3 Danish Vikings who had been taken prisoner during a raiding expedition the year before and had been kept as slaves on the farm. With these new recruits to guide them, Egil and his men found their way to the Kurlanders' treasure room and stripped it bare. The men thought they had enough adventure and profit for one day's foray, but Egil objected that it was not warrior-like to slip away in the dark. He told his men, "We have stolen the farmer's property, and he does not know it. Let us return to the farmstead and tell the people what has been going on." The others refused to listen to him and went back to their ship. Egil searched out the farmer alone. Coming upon a fire, he picked up one of the logs, carried it to the hall where the Kurlanders were carousing, and thrust it under the eaves of the roof. The roof caught fire, and brands began falling on the banquet table. As the building burned, most of the befuddled Kurlanders died where they sat. Those who tried to push their way out of the door fell under Egil's axe. When they were all dead, Egil marched back to the ship and claimed, and got, the lion's share of the booty. He then moved on, making additional and always profitable raids along the way of the coasts of Denmark, Holland, England, Sweden, and Norway. Finally, as the years passed, even Egil began to feel old and tired and returned to a farm in Iceland, where he took up the life of a wealthy bondi on his land. He lived on to be a feeble, crippled, blind old man huddling by the fire, ignored by his kinsfolk, scolded by cooks and servant girls for getting in their way. But the Viking fires burned on in eagle until the end. He went out riding one day with 2 slaves and his chests of silver. He came back alone and never said a word of what had become of the slaves or the silver. Presumably he had buried the whole lot. Later that year, Eagle died and was buried with his weapons. Generations passed, and some outsized human bones were dug up and generally believed to be eagles. The skull was remarkably large and heavy. It was set on a churchyard wall, and someone decided to test its hardness by swinging at it with the reverse side of an axe. But the skull neither dented nor split. It only bleached in the sun, turned white, and became a constant reminder for anyone who passed by it of the hardiness of Eagle Skallagrimsson, and became an aspirational totem for all Viking kind. Such was the stuff of the Vikings.